Hey, everybody. Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. I'm here with my dude, Aris Pina, of course, CompuBox operator and fellow fight history file like myself, here to talk about last-minute replacements. Man, last weekend we had a lot of boxing, but of course, one of the most prominent fights apart from Keith Thurman was Bam Rodriguez winning the vacant WBC super flyweight belt from Carlos Cuadras, and he was a last-minute replacement. So we're talking about more.
Two classes.
Man, it's just like it. How often does it even happen, Aris, that like somebody comes in like that and swoops in and steals shit, dude? Well, we're talking about that shit today.
Yeah, man. It's one of those things in boxing that they always say anything can happen. It really can. To guys with two fists, as long as they can land or something crazy, shit happens in the ring. And with that being said, yeah, that was a pretty big significant fight for him because Bam became the first person born in the year 2000 or in the 2000s to become a world champion, making him the youngest world champion in boxing. And not only that, he moved up two divisions to fight a very proven guy in Cuadras, who went in there with a who's who of everyone and went toe to toe. And it's been, whether win or lose, has been very competitive and near the top of the division for a very long time. So, yeah, that was a big task to handle. You know what I mean? And the size difference was definitely there when they got in the ring and you saw them together. But I mean, Rodriguez put on a beautiful exhibition, bro. He looked like a lot of people were comparing him to Orlando Canizales, and that's a very fair comparison. That footwork is incredible. When the way he shifted and slipped when he landed that uppercut in the third round to drop Cuadras was a thing of beauty. You know what I mean? So the fact of the matter is that he's only, 21, 22 years old, and he has a huge future ahead of him. Whether it's going to be at the division that he just acquired the title in remains to be seen because he is pretty small still. But regardless where it is, that kid's a star. You know what I mean? But yeah, he was definitely a last minute replacement because the first guy that was supposed to fight, Sister Cat, and was gonna fight Cuadras in a rematch. And that was I think that was probably the one fight that hasn't happened out of the
The new four kings or whatever.
Exactly. If you want to give the four kings Monkio to anyone, give it to them. Definitely. And I guess that was the one fight that hasn't happened in a rematch yet, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so it makes sense. And I mean, I was waiting for
I was
it.
looking forward to it. Absolutely. That fight was going to be explosive regardless. Cuadras is not the type that runs away, throws a ton of punches, stays right in there. Obviously, so runs by. We've seen him over the years and how much of a badass he absolutely is. And considering both guys, especially so runs by, has gotten better over the years. I mean, but that was going to be an all-out shootout. But when Bam stepped in, that got a lot of people's attention. Everyone was really, really excited about it because not only was he a super prospect that just had world title written all over him, it was a matter of if, it was just when. The fact that he was stepping up and jumping up two classes just made it even more intriguing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that it was like the last minute replacement status, Bam Rodriguez, and coming into this opportunity, not really knowing where Carlos Cuadras is in his career, and it still remains to be seen what the win really means. I guess we need to see what Cuadras goes on to even do. And personally, I wouldn't have any issue with him still fighting Srisaket Sorong Vasai. I mean, just to round that shit out.
Please, yeah, absolutely.
For closure. And I didn't think that Carlos Cuadras looked so bad that he's shot or shouldn't be fighting or anything like that. And it was a really good win from Bam Rodriguez. And on top of that, the willingness, the being willing to step in last minute like that. I mean, not a lot of fighters are. And of course, not everybody's ready to be fair. They can call anybody. And if somebody's not training and they can't make weight, they can't make weight. But nonetheless, you also have to be willing to take that chance. And he was willing to take that chance. So paid off.
No, it really did. Like you said, man, when people were worried about the size difference at first and it was kind of sizable, when they got in the ring, it was the skill set that he had, man. He just knows how to place his shots. He fights so mature for a young fighter the way he is. I mean, I understand he's been fighting since he was a little kid and, he's been with the Garcia Boxing Academy for a long time now. And obviously all their fighters are very, very well versed and world champions galore. But, Cuadras also was putting a lot of pressure on him, and it wasn't just like one-way traffic throughout this fight. After he got dropped, he kind of stepped into another gear after that, and he laid hands on Bam. He was landing a lot of punishing body shots. You saw Rodriguez's face really marked up afterwards, stuff like that. Cuadras was, yeah, he outthrew Rodriguez. He did not land him. Bam was much more accurate, but Cuadras, like you said, was by no means not competitive. He was there right to the very end and made it very, very tough. And so yeah, Rodriguez, not only did he win a world title from this and has a very, very recognized name on his ledger now, he passed a lot of tests in this fight. So yeah, man, the future's only up for him. But again, I'm just curious to see what he's gonna have to do. I know there's a lot of big fights on the horizon there at the new division that he's at now. And but he also still hinted that he's much willing and able to go back down if the right opportunity arises.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just his age and whatnot makes it, like you kind of alluded to earlier, we're not entirely sure where he's even going to wind up division wise. But it was a great win. And the ability to come in last minute like that and put on a show, win or lose, I guess is what we're here talking about today, based off of that, obviously. But, just kind of going through history and talking about fighters throughout history who have come in as last minute replacements. And I mean, we'll probably talk mostly about wins today, but perhaps a couple losses or famed losses too. There's some good ones. But what's like, I don't know, like the epitome of last minute replacement for you? Like, you think of last minute replacement opponent that's like notable. What's that for you?
I mean, the first one that came to mind is actually a loss, but the reason why I say it's just so notable is the first one I really remember reading about as a kid, because they made a KO magazine award after it, basically with the unofficial official awards, more or less, right? And so I'm being kind of common here, if you want to call it that, but I'm going with Zuma Nelson, Salvador Sanchez, and it's pretty last minute. I mean, like, it wasn't to the point where like Nelson got the call 2 days before or something like that, but like it was still a last minute opponent. And back when it happened in 1982, absolutely nobody knew who Nelson was, so that in itself. And from reading about it, I remember just reading about it as a kid, like in the magazines, because they talked about that fight a lot. And Roy Jones actually talked about it on television and said it was his all-time favorite fight. I believe he said something to that effect. Unlike
It's a great fight.
It was an incredible fight, a fight that no one expected it to be incredible either. Supposed to be just like a walkover, but Roy Jones mentioned that. He said, oh, I've watched that fight over 100 times. Sanchez was one of his favorite fighters, and when Roy said that as a kid, that made me much more intrigued about Sanchez. Reading that he died in a car accident at a young age made me more intrigued. The fact of the matter is there was no YouTube or me having any type of internet really that I can watch footage of him in the mid 90s made me even more kind of like, damn, I didn't even know what he looked like until one day I picked up a Ring magazine and they did a countdown of like the 50 best fighters of the last 50 years or something like that. And Sanchez was in it. And when I saw his face, I did not expect. I was like, whenever I thought of it, like I thought he had some kind of mustache and beard and had a certain hair, whatever it may be, right? And then when I finally saw him as a clean-faced dude with an afro, I was like, whoa, kind of blew my mind. That was the last thing I expected. And then there was the photo of him just jabbing the shit out of Danny Lopez, and you just see that fro again, and I'm like, that is not what I expected to look at. And that just so it took a few more years, and then I was finally able to win an auction on eBay, which that had a bunch of fights. It had Gomez Pintor, it had Zarate Zamora, and it had Sanchez Nelson. That was the main one I wanted, and I ended up winning it. And then it
must go back a little bit for to get that on eBay.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking, Jesus, when was that? 2000, maybe around then, probably 2001. I don't know, something around then.
Damn.
Yeah, man. So finally watching that fight and then watching it, that just made me even more just like, holy shit. And everything just kind of came full circle for it. But, the backstory to it was Sanchez was originally supposed to be fighting a fighter by the name of Mario Miranda, who was an undefeated Colombian contender at the time. And, a tough guy, but he was much more of an unknown as well. His main attributes was that he scored a bunch of knockouts and he was really tall and gangly. So people expected a lot of big things from him. But Miranda ends up falling out, and then that's when Nelson came in. And Zuma Nelson at the time was, what was he, Pat? Around 13-0?
Something like that. Yeah, it was he had in the teens his fights for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But early on, most of his early fights were, at Accra, Ghana and stuff like that. But you have to remember, even though that was happening, his early pro fights, his first pro fight was against a guy named Billy Kwame. It was a 10-round decision. Most guys turning pro, they don't fight 10 rounds like that. Nelson was already built different. Third pro fight, he was already in a 12 rounder. He scored a knockout. Fourth pro fight, same thing, 12 rounds and stuff like that. So Nelson was already gaining decision, and he was already like moving on and winning the Ghanaian featherweight title, the African Union boxing title, and then pretty soon, before you knew it, he was already winning the Commonwealth featherweight title. So he was making strides at that point, and he was moving pretty fast, but he was still an unknown commodity because in 1982, who was really following like that? You know what I mean? And so when Nelson gets the opportunity to get this fight, everybody is just kind of like, Azuma who? All right, it doesn't really seem like much of a big deal, but Nelson, from all accounts and from what reading different various things and talking to people who were involved in the fight, took it absolutely seriously. Like he just went wild with it. And Nelson at that point was with Mickey Duff. And so when reporters and other people were talking to Duff and asking beforehand, well, what do you think about Sanchez and, his chances and all this other stuff? And then people asked him, they was like, when they asked him, they're like, hey man, can he fight? And then Duff just kind of laughed it off. He was like, yeah, you'll see. But when it came to it, the day of the fight, there's been footage. You see, there's like footage out there of the weigh-in and other stuff going on before it. But I've read that Nelson actually ran all around MSG before the fight, like the day of, just like he was so hyped up and everything. And like, I don't think anybody expected what they were going to expect. But coming in there, he gave Sanchez an absolute hell.
I've mentioned it before when we've talked about Zuma Nelson. I've mentioned before that I've read his I guess it's biography. I mean, but there's so many quotes in it that's almost a friggin' autobiography. And he talks about the fight, and I mean, a lot of it is from his perspective, Zuma Nelson's perspective, and like there's just like an excuse for dang near everything in there, which I guess you'd expect if it's
he's
from
always
his.
done that for all of his fights, though. Nelson's been the type of guy who, yeah, he's always
got some funny story or like funny thing about that. Earlier that day I ate something. He's got some weird story for everything. But yeah, I mean, he basically says that if he had gotten a full training camp for this, that he would have won. And it's kind of like when Bren and I talked about Louis Klitschko, for instance, and I say this every time somebody brings this up, like, Vitaly Klitschko was a last minute replacement, so he had a short training camp, and it's kind of like, well, so did Lennox Lewis, dude. Like, I mean, he also fought Vitaly Klitschko, last minute. So I mean, Salvador Sanchez also fought Zuma Nelson last minute, and now we know
exactly.
Zuma Nelson was a fucking badass. I mean, he was young, he was green, obviously, but we know that he was a badass, and he turned into a much better fighter. So I mean, it's the point being that they both fought each other on short notice. Like, so that's I guess one of the
And as you watch the fight, Sanchez is clearly like, I'm not going to use collecting data because I hate that stupid ass term.
He's downloading the matrix. He's
whatever you want to call it. But Sanchez is clearly learning as each round goes around because he was startled at first as you watch the fight. I'm sure people listening to the show have seen the fight, and you can tell that he doesn't know what the hell is going on for the first few rounds. Like, he doesn't really know how to take Nelson, because Nelson, I want to say he was absolutely wild. There was clearly skill in there, but like, he was very aggressive, and he was fast, and he was flurrying, and he was Ali shuffling even a couple of times. Like, he was really confident, and he was strong, as we obviously know throughout the years and everything. And Sanchez, just like you just mentioned, he didn't know anything about him beforehand, was kind of taken aback. He didn't really know how to handle it at first. But Sanchez, also being Sanchez, one of the smartest fighters in ring history, each round he started, he's studying in him, started picking up little things here and there, started figuring out things. And then by round 7, when he landed that monster left hook that dropped Nelson for the first time, that was the brilliance of him. That by that point, he started figuring, he found a pattern of what he was working with. But Nelson, to his credit, still came back and still made it for a dramatic fight until, the finish.
Yeah, you can tell that. I mean, and like I said, Nelson obviously wound up being a great fighter, but you could tell even just stylistically, he doesn't have a very easy style to figure out. He's a natural counter puncher, but he's an aggressive counter puncher. So he's the kind of counter puncher like that puts pressure on you with his posture and with the way that, like his footwork and stuff like that. But he's not like a lot of counter punchers lay back, but he's not. Like, he's constantly on your ass, but then takes what you give him. And then he had an incredible uppercut, really great hook. And you could tell that Sanchez was having a difficult time trying to figure out his style. And I mean, obviously in the later rounds, he clearly did figure out the style, but there weren't too many moments in that fight where he was like out of danger. At any moment, Zuma Nelson was still in that shit and he was still able to dig deep. And on top of, the style or whatever, just really tenacious, like never ending reserve of energy. It seemed, that's what made him great later on too, was that he was just a punching machine at times when he needed to be. Dude was a really, really great fighter. One of my favorites to watch for sure.
Yeah, my all-time favorites. One of a great fighter. And also has to be mentioned, bro, man, must be intimidating as hell to hear Nelson's supporters around ringside. Usually you've heard it in what Nelson, you heard it Ike Corte fights and other ones when you hear like the banging of the drums and other stuff. I'm not sure if that would be really allowed today, but back in, their time, in their primes and stuff like that, obviously I found it to be pretty exciting when I watched them fight. I loved to hear that shit when I was a kid. I thought it was awesome. But to be their opponent must have been just like,
yeah, I mean, that would have been pretty wild, like the amount of noise and shit like that. There are a handful of crowds where that type of stuff happens. Like, for instance, there have been a number of times where I've seen Argentine fighters fight in person. Man, those fans go and make some fucking noise for sure. But like, there are a handful of other kinds of crowds that will just get up and
Ricky Hatton, for example, with the drums and the horns of their fights. I mean, any of those type of atmospheres. I'm just saying, being there,
oh my god, yeah, it's crazy.
It's a very intimidating atmosphere. I mean, Sanchez was cut from a different cloth. He wasn't. You can tell nothing really fazed him. But talking other opponents with Nelson and stuff like for example, you remember his third fight with Jesse James Leija, which was on Boxing After Dark, when that was when he was totally in the zone and kind of having like his late career renaissance and blasted Leija and just kind of beat him up throughout the fight.
Yeah.
So those, like the drums and everything, was so prominent ringside because I think it was kind of like a smaller atmosphere. And you just hear like really, really awesome rhythms all surrounding, and different things. And as you hear these different clang and all the drums, that's when the overhand right comes in the first round. Pow! And Leija just drops like a ton of bricks, and you see he's totally bushwhacked in the face. And Roy Jones prematurely starts yelling, "He's not going to get up. Leija's done. This fight is over. This fight is over." Trying to cut it off, but Leija would go on the last, additional 6 rounds.
Well, he was a super tough dude, and that
of course, absolutely
a good series. But yeah, usually Roy was pretty on point when he did the commentating and called the knockouts and shit. But Leija was tough.
But yeah, man, to get back to Sanchez Nelson really quick, after that fight, it was famously said that, like, because Don King told Sanchez, "Oh, this will be an easy one," and Sanchez kind of told him, "If this was supposed to be easy, don't give me a hard one." But Sanchez was supposed to was going to fight Juan Laporte in a rematch after this. Laporte, who he had defeated earlier in early defense around 1980, but then Sanchez unfortunately died a few weeks later after this fight, which everybody usually knows about. So yeah, man. But Nelson, to his credit, he took about a year to accumulate himself, had a couple of wins. He blasted, for instance, a guy named Irving Mitchell, who was a contender back in the 80s and 90s, in the 80s mostly, and blasted him in one round and a few other guys. But he really made his strides again when he fought Wilfredo Gomez for Sanchez's old title. And that's when his legend was born. He went out there and knocked out Gomez in a very, very tough fight in Gomez's hometown. And then from there, just went on to have the legendary career that, made him possibly Africa's greatest fighter.
That knockout of Gomez is great too. Like that
In the
final,
photo
like
of it, bro.
like bends like in a just
Yeah, yeah.
pretzels
And
in a
then do you see
gnarly
the
ass
way his
way.
neck goes up and then like his face is like contorted and kind of
Yeah, he's just like
brutal.
like
Yeah.
yeah. Azuma makes him bend in a way a human should not bend. And yeah, dude, he was a
Same
super,
tenacious way he fought Sanchez too. Same style, same
yeah,
everything.
just a
Young
super
Nelson.
great fighter. Gomez just wound up being, excuse me, a little bit too small, I guess, for 126. Like at 122, the guy was just a fucking bastard.
And
But
and by like when that fight took place. I wanted, oh, was it 84? Um, Gomez was probably already a step past that at that point because
oh
the
yeah,
outside
he'd
activities
been
and
around a while. Yeah, he'd pretty
so.
much cleaned out 122. So I
Mhm.
mean, yeah, but regardless, just another sign of how great Azuma Nelson was.
Absolutely.
But another actually in my first entry here, another African fighter figures into this because the very first fight that I thought of, I don't know, I just came up in my mind because why not? Was Manny Pacquiao's U.S.
Absolutely.
debut against our
Mhm.
boy Lelo Ledwaba.
Rest in
Um,
peace.
yeah, dude, we talked about Mr. Ledwaba, we talked about Azuma Nelson, and I mean, we need to revisit the greatest African fighters episode, which I even said at the start of that episode that like I know this is far too condensed. We're gonna have to break it down more than this later on.
Oh yeah, definitely, man. That's a
I mean,
multi-part.
like it was kind of like we're summing up as best as we could, but nonetheless, that's two fighters that we talked about on that episode, far more in depth for sure. But with Pacquiao and Ledwaba, uh, I'm kind of going off memory. I don't know for sure, but if I remember correctly, it was on the undercard of Oscar De La Hoya versus Javier Castillejo,
Correct.
and it was supposed to be Enrique Sanchez
Yep.
against Lelo Ledwaba, and Sanchez pulled out like he was sick or something, and it was like a week or two beforehand. And so Manny Pacquiao enters. And of course, at this time, in the early 2000s, in like what, 2000, 2001, this is still at the point where, I bring this up every couple episodes when we do the history talk and we're talking about just access to tapes and shit like that. Point blank, dude, you're not going to be a fan that saw too many Manny Pacquiao tapes unless you were like a high level writer, pundit, some shit like that who does tape trading in 2000 to 2001. Yes, now we know and we can go back and he was like, well, he was a lineal title holder for blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah, dude, I know that now. You know that now. We can fucking go on BoxRec. Back in 2001, when he got a late replacement for Layla Lidwaba, most people are going, I don't know who the shit that is. I'm just saying, like, most people didn't know. Most people didn't have access to the tapes from Thailand or the Philippines. But point is, he goes in there, and Lelo Lidwaba, who already is, by this time accomplished plenty in his career and is a very high level champion and is expected to just walk through a guy named Manny Pacquiao that nobody's really ever heard of before, winds up just getting blitzed, dude. You cannot go in against a guy like Manny Pacquiao with that kind of speed and that kind of like just southpaw punching style and like late replacement. Like already the style is so difficult to deal with, but as a late replacement with zero preparation for it, it's like that's the perfect example of what happens when you don't prepare for it and you're taken by surprise.
Yeah, man. Like you mentioned, bro, you and I, like I read about Pacquiao in Ring Magazine and knew that he was the former champion when he knocked the hell out of Dutch Chatra Kai. I can't even try to pronounce his name right now. Dutch boy Jim, as I know how they gave his last name, well, the person he was sponsored by, but it was
Chachai Sasakul.
that's a cool. Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
But Pacquiao then, he was one of those guys that you kind of figured, yeah, that was a big win. I remember he was fighter of the month and he was rated like number one in the ratings at that point and had a little bit of a following going for him, especially after he scored a pretty impressive knockout in his first title defense. I remember against I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, but he was a Mexican fighter who was featured on a Chavez undercard not too long before that. But anyways, after he lost his title, you kind of figured, well, there's a lot of fighters at the lower weight divisions, they kind of just disappear a little bit after a while, right? And I didn't think anything of it. But after a few months, you started seeing Pacquiao's name again in the results in the magazines. But he was there over fighting at like junior featherweight, bantamweight junior featherweight. I'm just kind of like, oh, looks like he jumped up a little bit. So you would see that, but again, not thinking much of it until, like you said, around two. I've never seen him. I never seen him actively fight. I wasn't a tape trader. I didn't have access to all that type of stuff. There wasn't any type of footage of him online. I just read a bunch of stuff. But when I heard that he was going to fight Laylo Ledwaba, that obviously got me intrigued because I had at least been reading about him. And knowing that he was a last-minute replacement, I knew he wasn't kind of no type of scrub. Like, he was a guy who could a legit fight. And having Freddie Roach in his corner, who obviously at the time didn't have the notoriety that he has today, but still was a well-known trainer, had me intrigued. But like I'm sure you thought, and no one else, that I wasn't going in there thinking Pacquiao was going to win and be like, oh yeah, this is going to be like, I wasn't, not pulling no hipster shit over here. Like, I thought, I was watching Ledwaba. I seen him on HBO. Like, he was a very impressive fighter at that point. He had a lot of really good wins on his ledger, and he was a really solid fighter. And a lot of people were considering him, thinking that he had a future pound for pound potential to him. But yeah, man, Pacquiao came in there and absolutely just stomped the hell out of him, bro. It was a thumping, really, really like crazy. And Ledwaba had that look on his face that many Pacquiao opponents would have over the years, where they just look absolutely bewildered after a few rounds. Like, what the hell?
They just don't even. It's so, bewildered for sure. That's like a great word. They're just totally.
They just look completely. They don't know. I mean, you just got a swarm of bees around you, and all of a sudden your face is bloodied and destroyed. And there was the same thing at, early Pacquiao back in the day, dude, when he was just absolutely annihilating guys. They all had that same look. Ledwaba had that look after like 4 or 5 rounds. You see his nose bloody, you see his face bloody and puffed up. He just doesn't know what the hell is going on. And finally he just goes down after accumulation. Jorge Alicia Julio, who was a very, very respected bantamweight champion back in the day, probably a little past it by the time he fought Pacquiao. But look, that fight was on the Tyson Lewis undercard, right? And Pacquiao blitzed him in 2 rounds, and look at Julio's face after the second round. His face, same thing, bloodied up, beat up. He doesn't know what the hell happened to him. No one had ever done that to him before. He had lost fights, but no one had ever just absolutely thrashed him like that.
Yeah, and I mean, in retrospect, dude, like, we probably should have seen the Barrera shit coming, because Pacquiao had already done it. And so then, like, here's Barrera, and it was the exact same shit, dude. Barrera was like, whoa.
After that first knockdown, not the one that Pacquiao got dropped in, because that was bullshit. But when his knockdown that didn't get called. Yeah, like was that early on, right?
Yeah, he knocked him down, but he didn't call it a knockdown.
That's right, but that was a legit knockdown.
Yeah.
And then the one that where it was actually called, you see Barrera's face when he got dropped, and he's just kind of like, dude. You already
he's
see
all swollen, and he's just like, what the fuck?
You already see the resignation on him, just kind of like, and that's when he started like trying to pull some dirty stuff on Pacquiao, hitting him low a couple of times and doing other stuff like, it took Eric Morales and all of his badass glory to finally like stop the storm of what Pacquiao was doing.
I guess you would call the Maidana fight more of like a last hurrah for Morales, but even so, like, as far as like a great win or whatever, that was definitely a last hurrah for Morales. He like just put it all together for one last night, fucking turned southpaw on the 12th like a goddamn badass motherfucker, and just fought his ass. And I mean, brings a smile to my, and then fucking ask fucking Merchant after that, "Te gustó? Do you like that shit?" And these Merchants just sitting there giddy like, fucking's awesome, dude. It was not even, I don't even give a shit about Pacquiao losing or anything. It was just fucking fun. But
Well, I mean, that was
incredible,
man. And that was the start of Pacquiao. Like, he had already had a really solid career before that. And say he had lost the Ledwaba fight and kind of just disappeared after that, he still would have had a good, respectable career. He wouldn't have been remembered. Probably only hardcore guys like us today would have been talking about him. But that was the start of his legend. It was unfortunate at the expense of Ledwaba, but imagine what would have happened if Enrique Sanchez never pulled out of that fight.
Yeah, I don't know, man.
I'm sure Pacquiao still would have got a shot at some point another time.
Probably. Yeah, but his, he really like catapulted to stardom, and that was definitely one of the first kind of steps in the US to do it.
And the fact that it was on a De La Hoya undercard on a paper.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, man. I remember that stupid ass card too, and being all angry because I think that was the last time, if I'm not mistaken, that De La Hoya fought with Top Rank
He was
because
fighting at the, in the what was that, 2001, the early 2000s, after, you know, Oscar had like this thing where he would fight like a Mosley on pay-per-view, and that was like a legit fight. But then he fight someone like Yori Boy Campos or Castillo on pay-per-view too.
yeah,
And you're supposed to pay 67, whatever it was the price for it back then, 50, $60 or something.
yeah, and I'm trying to remember if it was that fight or the well, whatever. It doesn't even really matter. But the point is, dude, I remember that entire stupid ass show and just remember being like, Castillejo was like big in Spain, and
Yeah.
like that was it. Like he had like a totally respectable career, and it was getting shat on like unfairly. But I just remember that card and everybody being mad about that card. But anyway,
I mean, he also, to his credit too, didn't he, after losing the Oscar, didn't he went on go on to knock out Felix Sturm?
yeah, no, he had, like I said, even before that, he had a totally respectable career. It's just that it was like he was operating kind of on the fringe of a division that was already kind of like it was top heavy. So, and he wasn't getting a shot at any of the actual good names. He was just knocking off the kind of like top level European dudes,
Okay.
basically. And so, like, he had I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Totally respectable career, like I said, and then went on to, kick Felix Sturm's ass. But in any case, yeah, I mean, uh, yeah, that was at the time he was pretty bemoaned as far as being an opponent for Oscar De La Hoya, because that was right about at the period where people were like, oh, he's not even a fighter anymore. He's like a part-time fighter. He's a singer. He's a this, he's a that. And so now he's fighting this guy on pay-per-view that nobody knows. And that was kind of like what many people, especially in the media, felt was like the downturn for De La Hoya or whatever. But, whatever. Anyway, I guess the good thing that card brought us was Pacquiao.
I mean, absolutely, bro. I've made a Star was born. Pacquiao has now become one of the greatest fighters in history. Just an absolute badass, a legendary figure, and one of those guys now that, like, a generational fighter that people will be talking about decades and decades and decades, 100 years from now, whatever, if this world's still around then. Um, you know, hate to be the Debbie Downer over here, but I'm just saying.
It's a long fucking bet. Yeah.
But yeah, man, Pacquiao is just one of those guys. You know what I mean? That like we'll be talking about in our old age and generations from there. Like, yeah, Pacquiao is incredible. But that was the start of it. And poor Ledwaba had to be the one that he's a recipient of it. But another one for me, and this one I've never actually seen the fight, but I read about it when it happened, and it's always just been like holy shit, because this is the definition of a last minute replacement. Was when a fighter by the name of Isidro Garcia fought for the WBO flyweight championship against Jose Lopez back in 1999. And what makes that so interesting is that um excuse me. What makes this so interesting is that Garcia was the last minute replacement while he was sitting in the audience um, for a fighter by the name of was it Fernando Montiel? No, it was Alejandro Montiel, not Fernando.
Yeah.
Alejandro Montiel. Yeah, excuse me. So Alejandro Montiel and Fernando Montiel, they're brothers, and Alejandro Montiel was a good fighter, not as good as Fernando. Fernando was the one that went on to have like a really, really solid career, and before he got absolutely obliterated by Nonito Donaire. But
Got his head dented. Yeah.
yeah. Jesus Christ. I mean, that was like a visual I'm still trying to like not remember from way back, but
Well, there you go. Sorry.
so anyways, though, what makes this fight so interesting, Alejandro Montiel, I believe it was, he had some kind of, he had to pull out the fight in hours beforehand. He was just in there, something that I think he was either having swelling or something going on, but it was something to the effect that he couldn't go on to fight. They wouldn't allow him to, so he had to pull out. And Isidro Garcia was sitting in the audience over there eating a hot dog, minding his business, just trying to, watch the show. So they came up to him with a proposition, hey, it's the very last minute. Would you want to fight for the WBO title? And he's kind of like, like, I'm over here eating and chilling. Like, you sure? And they're like, well, yeah. So they brought him into the room. He had to borrow some trunks, borrow boots, all this other type of stuff going on. And I believe I was reading too is that they had to grab a mouthpiece and that it wasn't made or anything like that. So they boiled it in a pot of coffee, which he detests. And he didn't drink coffee at all. So they had to boil in a pot of coffee. They made him, put it in like that. And that made him like, almost sick. And then went in there and boxed a 12-round decision to become WBO champion.
Yeah, dude, that's crazy. I mean,
that's a wild story.
Yeah.
And I know he was overweight. Like, it wasn't like he was weighing 112 for that fight. But I mean, Jose Lopez was already after the weigh-in himself too that put on weight. So they probably just said whatever.
Yeah, dude, that's crazy. Crazy that they could even find somebody that would, like, within a stone's throw. Because we know people who are like promoters and managers and matchmakers and shit now who are like, anybody, if you just weigh under 150 pounds and you're within 100 miles, like you can get here tomorrow, anybody, but that's pretty funny.
But I mean, it's happened a few times in boxing history where, like, crazily enough, where there's been a person in the audience where they plucked him out of there at the very, very last minute and said, hey man, we need you right now. And the guy's kind of like, are you sure? Really? Kind of here with my girl, or I'm doing this, or do you need me? And the guy was like, yeah, well, dude, how about this amount of money? Will that do you in? The guy's like, okay, throws his hot dog away and goes running over and gets ready to start changing in. Like, only in boxing.
It's nuts, dude. It's absolutely nuts. And it will, in the fact, like, you think about like trying to, I mean, that shit's like the type of shit that would be too extreme in a movie about like football or something like that. Call up somebody and get them to play in the blah blah, Super Bowl or some shit last night.
No, boxing's the only sport where someone can be sitting on their ass eating a bag of chips and drinking a beer and get called in a meeting and be like, hey, can you come in for a fight? And they're gonna do it. They don't do that for football. They're not gonna do that for any other thing. And that's what happened. Like, I mean, to his credit, like, Garcia was the type of fighter that always kept himself in shape and everything like that. And he was undefeated, not for that fight. He had lost a fight to that point to a fighter by the name of Sammy Stewart, who was a very tough journeyman back in the 90s around the flyweight, junior bantamweight divisions. And I actually remember watching that fight on TV. I was on like FSN or something. Garcia got stopped on cuts. But yeah, for him to go in there and get catapulted to become WBO champion. And in 1999, WBO, I still wouldn't say that it was really well respected in the US side, right? More so just in the lower weight divisions. It meant more obviously in Europe on that side of the pond. But this still, having a belt, whether it was the WBO or whatever it was back then, still was going to get you recognized. And being flyweight champion, that would definitely get you more dates and more recognition, as opposed to being like WBO, I don't know, heavyweight, cruiserweight champion or something, or super middleweight, you know what I mean? And so,
yeah.
Were you gonna?
Yeah. No, I was just saying, like with the WBO.
So that ended up actually happening with his career, because after he won that fight, he had a couple of title defenses, lost it to Fernando Montiel, Alejandro's brother, and then still had some high profile fights before his career rounded out.
That's pretty wild that, one could even come by any sort of world title. I mean, yeah, like you said, it was kind of fringe at that point, especially like in a division down that far for a lot of people. Like the WBO would have been like starting to get recognized or more recognized in division like heavyweight or even light heavyweight or something like that. But way down there, even so, regardless of how much credit somebody's going to get for it, it's still pretty wild to come across
it's absolutely wild. Like, with the heavyweight division, I'm going to say by 1999, even then the WBO still was kind of like, meh, no one really worried about it. It wasn't until, I'm going to say, the Klitschko brothers, even in their early phases of, like, when Vitaly Klitschko became WBO champion, it wasn't like people were hollering and clamoring for him for unification fights or anything like that. He had beat Herbie Hyde for the belt.
Yeah.
And then when Chris Bird had beat him, that's when Bird became champion. That was aired on HBO. That got attention. Bird was a last minute replacement. That's actually a good one to bring up too, because Bird replaced Razor Ruddock in that fight, who probably would have got absolutely obliterated by Klitschko, considering when it was supposed to take place. But Bird, who was losing that fight completely, he was competitive and he was landing here and there and landing punches to the body, but he was getting outboxed comprehensively. What was it? Klitschko tore his rotator cuff or something?
Yeah, he had some sort of shoulder injury and
Yeah,
pulled out.
yeah. And then Bird became champion. So it was around that time, and that's when the WBO started gaining traction because Vladimir became champ. He started getting featured on HBO all the time, and yada yada
Yeah.
yada.
Well, there were a couple, like right around that same time, there were a couple of other champions and other divisions that were like, for instance, Darius Mikulchevsky
Yes.
held the WBO light heavyweight title for like a number of years, and I mean, that's its own podcast. But I mean, like, and then I think what really helped solidify it beyond the heavyweight was that when Bernard Hopkins won all 4 titles at middleweight from Howard Eastman, like he,
Yeah.
unified from Howard Eastman, who I think at the time was also the British middleweight champion. And basically, I think that helped solidify because Bernard Hopkins was like, I wanted all 4 of the titles. So now I'm truly undisputed or whatever.
Was
And
Oscar
so
WBO champ?
what's that?
Was Oscar Oscar was WBO champ at middleweight at that point, right? Didn't he beat Stern?
Yeah, but I mean, like before
Oh,
that,
before that, yeah, that's right. Yeah, what he's okay. And
yeah,
then also too, you can also
I think
mention
Harry Simon too. I want to say
Harry,
was
yeah,
held the
Harry
title
Simon,
for
and
that.
also Mikuchevsky became undisputed champion at light heavyweight before Hopkins did at middleweight. The problem was, like you mentioned, since he fought over in Germany on the other side of the pond, um, it didn't really gain that much traction because remember he beat Virgil Hill to unify the belts. I don't know if that was for the undisputed belt because I think Roy Jones might have been champion at that point too.
Yeah,
But
so it wasn't fully undisputed,
yeah,
but
it wasn't fully
technically
undisputed. Yeah, I
he
forgot Roy was already up at that point.
well, and technically because of that, technically Mikulchevsky. I mean, dude, it's messy, but technically
So messed.
Mikulchevsky was the lineal champion, and that's what made it so messy was that Roy Jones went over and unified the other belts, but Mikulchevsky was technically the lineal champion. So
Mm.
it's like, but then what do you do? Well, whatever. Anyway, like I said, its own fucking podcast. But let's see. I had my list of last minute replacements here. Let me go back to 1914. And this is a fairly famous last minute replacement that also involves yeah, it also involves a world title. There were fighting brothers, Joe and George Chip. I mean, like they're pretty obscure, I think, even among like the history people. Like you don't really hear too much about George Chip, don't really hear too much about Joe Chip, and you don't really hear that much about Al McCoy either. They say that Al McCoy and right around that a couple years before that, uh, you know, the Kid McCoy, Charles Kid McCoy, those two helped make that kind of McCoy last name famous in boxing. But Al McCoy was actually, a lot of people don't know this little tidbit of trivia. Al McCoy was the first ever Southpaw world champion, period, when he won this title. He wound up defeating George Chip because Joe Chip, George's brother, was scheduled to fight Al McCoy. Joe wound up having to pull out because of an injury or something like that. So George Chip stepped in to fight Al McCoy. And so, in any case, Al McCoy winds up defeating George Chip and taking the middleweight title. And it wound up being somewhat controversial at the time because like right around this time, I'll try not to go into too much of a rant or a seg or whatever here, but in any case, right around this time when different states were wrangling for whether or not championship fights could even be fought in that state, whether or not championship fights would be 10 rounds, 12 rounds, 15 rounds, etc., because different states had different rules at different times. And so some states didn't even allow decisions, and fights would only end either by knockout or it would be a no contest if it didn't, wouldn't go to a decision, et cetera, et cetera. And so right around this time, there would sometimes be like arguments as far as like whether or not a fight was legit or whether or not a champion was legit. And that's what wound up happening here is because of the late replacement and because of where it took place. There was a lot of controversy in the newspapers not wanting to declare Al McCoy middleweight champion. But in any case, it goes down in the history books, and he's the first ever Southpaw champion.
Yeah, bro. The fight before what happened beforehand too was that they said that they asked the Chip to step in because they figured that McCoy wasn't in his class and it was just gonna be an easy win for him or whatever it might be. But yeah, it was one of the. I believe that McCoy was actually trained by Rocky Marciano's trainer over there,
Charlie Goldman.
Charlie Goldman, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah. Now I'm trying. Now you got me. I'm thinking it was Al Singer, McCoy, maybe one other
Because I
champion.
think McCoy was his first champion, I want to say.
No, I'm sorry. He had 5 when you include Marciano. So yeah, I'm missing one, but yes, McCoy, Al Singer. Anyway, yeah, go ahead. But
Yeah, I want to say McCoy was his first champion, right?
I'd have to look at the list, but yeah, I think so.
But yeah, right around that time, man, that's when the middleweight division started getting super middleweight, excuse me. That's when the middleweight division started getting muddled as any type of division, because like you said, as you just alluded to, most people, there was always these different jurisdictions, different states that wanted to consider have their own world champion, and they had no problem not recognizing a fight if they didn't like what the decision really was and saying, okay, if it was controversial or whatever, and they're gonna say, okay, nah, this guy's gonna be champion. For example, there was a really controversial fight one time between middleweight champion Johnny Wilson and challenger Brian Downey, where I forgot what the full details of it, but I think Wilson got dropped and Downey might have hit him when he was down, and Wilson couldn't continue, yada yada yada. But it was a fight that Downey, it looked like he was winning and in control of, and so a lot of people said Downey should have won by knockout. Other people said Wilson should have won by disqualification. So a couple of states recognized Downey as champion. Most states still recognize Wilson as champion. They ended up having a rematch that Wilson won, so it made that point moot. But still, that's just to give you like some context of what you were just kind of alluding to. That's what goes down.
Yeah, it wasn't always that clear, and so that's why when people make claims like the 8 world champion or the 8 divisions or
absolutely not. Dude. It was so muddled
when there was only one champion per division, and I don't want to be that guy that's like actually, every time somebody says that, but I kind of just want to be like, I don't, dude. There were a lot of times during these golden periods of boxing where it was not clear, where there was a lot of like dispute in newspapers and shit like that. I mean, and there are a number of famous fights where shit, the welterweight championship changed hands from Joe Walcott to
Dixie Kid.
Yeah, Dixie Kid, and then it gets given back when they figure out the referee bet on Dixie Kid, yes. Or then the light heavyweight championship gets transferred to Battling Siki, and then actually the ref's like, actually I think I'm going to disqualify him, and then the crowd speaks up and it says, "Fuck you, ref," and the ref's like, actually okay, give it to him. Think about these are the golden periods of boxing, and think about if some shit like that happened today. You know what I mean? The crowd
imagine what would happen today, right?
The crowd talks the referee into reversing a decision. Like there would be fucking anarchy, bro.
Imagine if a crowd witnessed Adwal against Mexican Joe Rivers, where
the ref like carrying him and
picking
shit.
up Walgas, who's completely unconscious from a legal blow, and Rivers laying there clutching his groin and looking up at the ref like, "What the hell are you doing?" That famous photo where he's like pulling Walga up, and you see Rivers, this poor guy, just looking up like that, like
Yeah, like, dude, he's like laid out, like.
Yeah, Walgas is gone. Because they landed a right hand that knocked Walgas out, and Walgas landed a low blow simultaneously that dropped Rivers, and they both collapsed on top of each other. And then the referee said Walgas wins by knockout, hopped on a train, and got out of town.
Yeah, imagine some shit like that happening now. It's just so difficult to imagine. I mean, it's not. No, hold on. Let me rephrase that. It's not that difficult to imagine it happening, honestly. But it's that, like, the idea that it happened kind of like just unchallenged and unchecked, and that it just goes down in history, like whatever. That's what I'm saying. Is that's the whole crazy part of this,
It's man, it's absolutely insane. And another part too, like the muddle, even a decade or a couple of decades, about a decade later in the 30s, right? Because you have that whole muddled division, how messed up it was before everything got kind of settled up with Tony Zale back then. But like, how many guys were claimed and title claimants to the middleweight championship? You know what I mean? You had Al Hostak, you had Solly Krieger, you had Isidro Garcia, you had Marcel Till, you had this one, you had that one. There were Gorilla Jones, Lou Brulio. There was so many guys at that point that were champion at one point or another, or different places were calling this one champion, and it was insane.
Yeah, and
If
then
you try to
you
even
bring
go through that
the
rabbit hole,
Europeans
try to
into
look
it.
it up, you gotta get on there. The headache looking at that.
Yeah, you bring the European claimants into it, and it got even worse. Like it got even like, oh shit. So I mean, it wasn't that clear. And that's why I don't want to be that guy, but I also want to make sure people understand the full scope of history, that it's complex, and that it wasn't always like, back when there was only one champion per division. Nah, dude, there was a lot of claimants sometimes. And I mean, anyway, yeah. Point being, with this whole Al McCoy, George Chip situation, as you kind of alluded to, Al McCoy was thought of before the fight as they were saying, oh, well, he's not in the same class. Well, Al McCoy was also, they say, the person who the term the Real McCoy is coined after, because they say that Al McCoy used to literally fake being sick or fake being shot, like not good, punch drunk, whatever, or would say that he's not in good shape. And then he'd come in and just absolutely beat the shit out of an opponent because he was in good shape. He wasn't sick. He's not shot. He would just fake it. And so that's what they say that they coined the term the Real McCoy, because they would say, so which McCoy are we going to get tonight? Are we going to get the Real McCoy? And so then that's when they started saying, oh, this shit's legit. This shit's the Real McCoy. So in any case, that's what they say anyway.
Yeah, man. And regardless of anything, that is a huge upset. One that you mentioned, it doesn't get mentioned at all because it did happen over 100 years ago. And with everything that's happened in boxing history, it kind of does fall into the cracks because it wasn't like full on claiming. It was a middleweight title change, definitely, and it should be recognized as such in history. But there was differences of opinion, everyone, all this other stuff going on, but it was big. This is like, and that was the first one where you can really use a mention last minute replacement, definite last minute replacement, and it kind of like backfired on everybody because they thought it would just be like an easy layup.
Yeah, for sure. That's especially I would imagine the bettors, and this is how back in 1914 a large portion of the purses and the money that's going in and out of these clubs and shit like that is coming through the bettors. And I would imagine that, man, that shit was a messy situation.
I'm sure everyone's kind of sat there with their jaws dropped when it happened because no one expected that. They were just thought, oh, Al McCoy will get his ass whooped. You know what I mean? And you're talking to, and I'm sure if there was footage of it, you probably see Chip in there probably looking very calm, nonchalant, not thinking anything twice of it. And all of a sudden,
blammo.
Yeah. And it's worth noting too that they did they definitely did fight after this too.
Yeah, they fought twice after that. I think both went to like newspaper decisions or no decisions or whatever.
But it wasn't for the title.
No, yeah, it wasn't for the title because at that point the title started kind of playing musical chairs. Yeah, for a little while after that until the early 20s.
So yeah, but another one that is worth mentioning, obviously, and now we're moving up over to 1969, and this goes with another guy who was a very very popular fighter back in the day. He's a Hall of Famer subsequently from it, and associated with the Mike Tyson custom auto camp. But this is Jose Torres' last fight, and it's a guy against a guy by the name of Charlie Devil Green, who I wouldn't say he was a contender. He was a tough guy. He was just gatekeeper, so to speak, a veteran. But at that point, he was only 10-5. He didn't have a tough career, but literally plucked out of the crowd the day of the fight by Teddy Brenner because a fighter by the name of Jimmy Ralston, who was a contender at the time, pulled out at the very, very last minute, claiming arm injury, claiming some kind of injury. He didn't want to go through with the fight. So probably money-wise or some shit. But regardless of what it was, Charlie Green was in the audience that day eating, whether it was a hot dog or a donut or whatever story you want to hear. He was eating something and just kind of hanging out. Wasn't expecting to fight at all. And Brenner came up to him and asked him, basically, hey, it's the very, very last minute. He talks about it in his book. If only, in Brenner's memoir book, what was it called? If Only This Ring Was Square.
Yeah.
So he definitely talked about this fight in the book because it is pretty crazy. He plucked Green out of the audience at the very last minute, offered him a purse. Green apparently said, was quoted as I've read. He said something to the effect of, "Hey, you're going to pay for my hot dog as well." And Britain, deal was struck. They got in there, and Green actually dropped Torres twice in the first round before getting stopped in a wild shootout.
It wound up being Torres' last fight of his career, and convinced him to hang up the gloves. I mean, I think that Torres, who worked with Customato and also employed, a really similar style. Like, to me, that's one of the weirder things. And I know that trainers have kind of like their own style that they like to teach and shit like that.
But the peekaboo thing that he did with everybody.
Yeah, but to me, that's so weird that like you would take such a unique style, in a style that really does not work for everybody, and try to make everybody use it. Like, I don't know. To me, that's
kind of
just
like Joe Frazier.
Yeah, exactly like Joe Frazier, whose son was a perfectly good amateur until
Under
Joe
the
got
tutelage of George Benton, and probably would have been an incredible pro under the tutelage.
Better than he was anyway.
Absolutely. And instead,
He wasn't made for
doing
that
the
style.
ducking and diving, trying to look like Joe Frazier, emulating his dad. Yep.
Yeah, dude, he wasn't made for that style.
No, and neither was Kevin Rooney.
Tyson's or for that weight, probably. He probably wasn't made for heavyweight.
Absolutely no. There was no way he was a heavyweight. You saw the difference against Holmes. It was ridiculous. But yeah, it's so sad. But yeah, that's the type of thing. Like, D'Amato had. Don't get me wrong. He's a legend in the sport and has his own acclaim and all that. But
I know, dude, it's a sin to try to say anything cross about about Customato.
Yeah, right. Seriously, but the truth of the matter is that D'Amato completely was freaked out by anyone who had a pulse in the heavyweight division while Floyd Patterson was champion. And thus anyone who was really good, whether it be Eddie Machen, Zora Foley, Sonny Liston, Cleveland Williams, the list goes on and on. If you could really fight, you were obviously mob tied, and thus you couldn't get next to Floyd. So
yeah, dude. Yeah,
Tom McNeely, he's not in the mob. All right, he can fight Floyd because he couldn't fight. Roy Cut Shoot Harris, same thing.
Yeah, and didn't Tom McNeely put him down too? Like, so yes. I mean, almost got him, buddy.
Harris dropped him. Pete Rademacher, who was making his pro debut, dropped him. The list goes on and on. So probably it's for the best that he
just very, very strange relationship.
It was just the way he just had like this wild out. Anyone who could actually fight, anyone who like really, really was a good contender was automatically mobbed up and had all kinds of issues. And he'd go on this wild rant that just like, people today would be looking like, dude, you serious?
Yeah. And
imagine him with a Twitter handle.
Dude, and he just strikes me, especially now in retrospect, as somebody, as they say, thou doth protest too much. Like, dude, if you're constantly screaming about the mob and constantly screaming about corruption, it's almost like drawing attention to yourself. Like,
exactly. But
I don't know, buddy.
He was, like you mentioned, he was that type of guy that had everybody had to have that type of same style of peekaboo. But it doesn't work for everybody. It worked for Mike Tyson. It works for Floyd Patterson.
Well, he's trained world champions and I haven't, so I won't argue too hard. But regardless, that's always kind of been strange to me.
But Torres was only 33 in that fight. You know what I mean? And he didn't have a long career. Didn't have a tough career. Sure, Florentino Fernandez, the monster punch that he was, knocked him out. But Torres never really took a ton of punishment in his career. He didn't have really taxing fights. His fights with Dick Tiger, for that matter, he was more outboxed than he was beat up in them. So
yeah, I think one of his big downfalls is he didn't have much of a punch. Like, he didn't have a real big punch, and so he wound up having to rely on grit. He wound up having to rely on skill. And so, that was probably, not so much his downfall, I guess, but just that was, I think, one of the reasons why he was unable to really get over the hump. He was a very good champion, but not a really great champion. Nothing wrong with that.
Kind of convinced him. This was the fight that convinced him.
Exactly. Yeah, this was the fight where he was just like, nah, if this guy's almost taking me out, I got to go. And he wound up becoming a really good writer after that too.
Oh, incredible writer. And he was a really, really nice guy too. I had the pleasure of meeting him a few times in my early years going to the Hall of Fame. And he was one of those guys, along with Aaron Pryor and a bunch of other people, that like he was there every year. Yeah, couldn't have been more accommodating and nice.
Yeah, it's tough to see any photos of him just like without a smile on his face.
Oh
'Cause
yeah, him and his wife. Oh, they were both the
he
most like
seemed like he loved
jovial,
that shit.
happy people. Yeah, they were just really cool. But he did play a very, very big part afterwards. You would always see him Mike Tyson's corner. He wrote that really the biography on Mike, which I have a copy of, and some other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and he also played a big role in he like worked with a lot of kids in the New York area and in boxing and stuff like that. He did something in boxing like his whole life,
Yeah.
pretty much. So I mean the guy was
Is he a Hall of Famer?
dude, I mean it's like Pastrano and
I know, man. You're kind of cutting hairs. I almost think it's just his name and who he was associated more get elevated him more so than his actual career. I don't
yeah,
know.
like I don't want to trash him because we just spent like a couple minutes like speaking nicely about him. I don't want to take that back,
Of
but
course.
well, and I mean, just I don't think being truthful is speaking badly about him. But
I don't
yeah,
know.
it's a thin compared to, I mean, especially at light heavyweight, it's kind of a thin ledger, dude.
And especially during that era too, man. That was an era of really deep era and a lot of
Yeah,
solid, great champions around then. Torres was just kind of
yeah.
he was there.
Cuss's
Yeah.
matchmaking was not helpful to the Hall of Fame ledger for sure. Um, let's see. One that I wanted to say mostly not because I actually didn't know about this. I'll bring it up just because it's a really good guide if you want to talk about last minute replacements, and a couple of these are in the article. But Michael Rosenthal for ESPN back in the day wrote an article about last minute replacements and matchmakers having to deal with last minute replacements. But I didn't know about this fight until I read this article. And I just didn't even know about this because I figured that this guy would have told me because I've spoken to him a number of times and don't know him super well, but know him well enough that I just figured this would have been one of the stories he told me. But a dude named Eric Bonilla, so Don Charjan, who was a matchmaker and promoter in Southern California for years and years and years. I mean, basically a Southern California legend, worked at the Olympic Auditorium, I mean, et cetera. Like he's a very well-known matchmaker in Southern California. So in 1978, a fighter named Eric Bonilla, who was pretty well known on the amateur scene, but was, more of a kind of like journeyman type of pro, to be honest. He was not a very high level pro whatsoever. But in any case, the reason why this stuck out to me is because through working with Steve 2 Pound Forbes with 2 Pound Sports and stuff like that, doing the local boxing thing in Portland, Eric Bonilla is actually one of the guys that's friends with Steve and has helped at some of these shows, knows just a ton of people in boxing. If you've been in boxing for a long time, especially on the West Coast, you probably know who Eric Bonilla is. He wound up going on to work with Don Charjan, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like Don Charjan like adopted him, or like something like there was some sort of like relationship there where they wound up being like family or something. I can't remember exactly what it was. He told me one time, but anyway, back in 1978, he's at lightweight, welterweight, or something like that, and Eric is going up and down in weight because he's fighting whomever is a journeyman. This dude named Erleis Perez, who they called Cubanito Perez, was making his pro debut, and Don Charjan needed somebody, like their fighter had fallen out, and so Eric Bonilla was in his last year of high school. They call up and they somehow get a hold of Eric Bonilla. He goes up to LA from San Diego and fights Erleis Perez and loses a decision. But then, it's kind of like, I think it was like about a month and a half later, Don Charjan needs another opponent for Erleis Perez and winds up calling down to Eric Bonilla's high school to get his phone number, gets his phone number from his high school, calls him up and asks him to come up. He says, I need you again to fight another opponent. And so Eric Bonilla winds up going up to LA, and as he's sitting in the dressing room waiting, I guess, he says, all right, who's the opponent? And Don Charjan won't tell him, but he's grinning. And so Eric Bonilla figures it out that it's Erleis Perez again, and that he's fighting him as an opponent again, and he goes out and he gets knocked out by him in one round. So, I mean, again, not a world title tale or anything like that, but it stuck out to me just because I know Eric, and I'm
Oh, yeah.
surprised he never told me that story.
That's awesome, man. It's like the type of thing when you can go back and then like you pull a stunt like that. It's pretty cool.
That's the kind of story where if I did that, I'd be telling
Yeah, I tell
everybody I
everybody
met.
shit. Absolutely.
I'd have that on a business card.
You tell everyone and everyone. Hey, you like just walk up to random people and just tell them the type of story what you just pulled right there.
Yeah, dude, shit's great shit. But
Here's a question for me: do you remember Bobby Boy Velarde?
Yeah.
Was he a last minute replacement against um
Morales.
against Ranchero Ramirez?
Oh, I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Juan Carlos Ramirez. Um, Reason why I ask is just because I almost feel like he might have been, because I remember Lampley telling the story that like because he was still in high school, and I think he called his principal or said something that they let him know that he was going to be at it, that who he was going to be fighting, what was going to happen that week, and then he ended up scoring an upset. I'm not sure if he was a last minute replacement or not, but
I honestly don't know.
here is one though that was a last minute replacement, and we're going to the heavyweight division in the '80s, my favorite decade. Think you know where I'm going with this. Bone Crusher Smith, Tim Witherspoon. Yeah.
Oh, famous. Just stop taking the last replacements, man. Just stop taking the last replacements.
I, you know, it's in a nutshell too, because like that was the last like nail in the coffin for Witherspoon in terms of like his prime, and Don King just absolutely just wrangling his career and screwing with him. But at the same time, Witherspoon has always said that he didn't care about losing that fight too, because he knew that since he lost, he was done with Don King, and so at that point it was almost worth it. But that's really sad, to think about that too.
Yeah,
because
dude.
Witherspoon, for that lost generation, was one of the most talented fighters out of that group. All right, they had talented fighters in there. We've talked about it before on the
Yeah,
show.
dude. He really was, and that's what sucks is especially because you could see it, and it was just that he would like get out of shape, and so
Yeah,
like you could see
because
that
he
he'd
wasn't
come into fights.
motivated, and
Yeah,
understandably so. If we were going through something like that, I probably wouldn't be motivated either.
yeah.
But you can
Moved
tell, man,
well,
like
good jab, booming
good
right
job.
hand.
Yeah. He was out jabbing Larry Holmes. He was catching Holmes and everything. He arguably beat Holmes in that fight.
A lot of
And
people still
Witherspoon
think so.
didn't
Yeah,
absolutely, and Witherspoon didn't have 20 fights at that point. Like he put on the fight of a lifetime. I'm sorry, none of the other heavyweights from that era were gonna do that to Holmes at that point. And Spoon was just one of so but he was screwed around. All right. He was going through a lot. Don King was just absolutely just destroying it with like for all the Don King messed with everybody. Don't get me wrong. Like, it wasn't, he messed with everybody in that era. Whether
6
you're a heavyweight,
decades.
lightweight, flyweight, didn't matter. He was gonna take some money out of you. But it
Six
almost seemed
decades, man.
6 decades, exactly, man. Thank you for that tweet, Kill Pat. He for like for whatever reason, he almost took like special pleasure in messing with Tim, it seemed. Like the worst thing he did to him, obviously, the one that would deflate anybody and obviously deflated Witherspoon, was the Bruno fight. Witherspoon went out there. Bruno was a huge, 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 massive, favorite in his country, and everybody loves him. The guy's a god out in England. And Witherspoon went to his backyard, really, really bruising fight. He was supposed to make close to $1 million, over 900,000 at least, or more than that. And then King swindled him so badly that he even make 100K. Like, imagine all of that, everything you did, and you were being promised you're gonna make this was gonna be the big fight. This is the one you're gonna be making money. Bruno made over $1 million because he wasn't involved with King, and and his handlers made his deal. Bruno made well over $1 million. He was all set. He had nothing to worry about. He lost the fight, but whatever. Who gives a shit at that point when you got all your money? Witherspoon got nothing out of that. So he goes into this fight now with the promise in a rematch with Tony Tubbs, another guy who had a lot of talent at that point, but just wasted it because of various reasons, mostly drugs at that point. But it was a rematch that nobody wanted, but this was Don King. He was just playing chess, picking and choosing whatever he wanted. So Witherspoon was promised if he wins this fight, he gets the chance at Mike Tyson, because they were doing the HBO tournament at that point, and this is why this fight was televised. And so last minute, Tubbs claims an injury, whatever it may be. There was no injury. Tubbs probably just bullshitted something out of it, but whatever it was, Tubbs pulls out. In enters Bone Crusher Smith at the very last minute. Bone Crusher Smith at that point was, you know, a mid-level contender, not a really skillful guy compared to the other heavyweights at that era, but a strong guy, very, very strong, very big, clubbing. Gave Larry Holmes a pretty good fight before he got stopped. Knocked out Buster Douglas early in his career. You know, it was match tough. It was always match tough early on. But he was also a guy that Witherspoon had already beat pretty comprehensively. It wasn't really a close fight. So him coming in as a last minute replacement, it was almost anticlimactic that Witherspoon should beat him again. But instead, in a fight that's almost kind of surreal to watch because Witherspoon clearly is not trying or just looks like he's in a zombie out of it. Bone Crusher Smith just comes out there and, yeah, kind of as his Monkey is, just beats the hell out of Witherspoon quickly and stops him quick.
Yeah, it looks like a combination of Witherspoon being like overwhelmed, but then the moment he realizes he's overwhelmed, he's like, fuck it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. He just kind of resigns to his fate and just kind of goes down and doesn't really care. And then you get that crazy post fight of Smith with his eyes bulging out of his head, running around with his hands up, you know, and that became his thing.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, it was that was that era, especially, you know. I think that it leads to, we've talked about it before, we've done an entire podcast about it before, but that the switching of the titles and just the way that everybody was partying and nobody was really able to stay consistent and stuff like that, it leads to that era getting discounted quite a bit. But there were some really good fighters during that era, and
they were really talented, wasn't Don King treating them like crap, man. He didn't give a damn. He treated them like hell. He had them all under his reign. And because of that, he didn't care who won or lost because he promoted all of them. He couldn't give a damn. And it was just easy for him, you know. Like, king. And he had HBO in his pocket at that point, and he had whatever else in his pocket. So if he told them, hey, I'm going to give you Tim Witherspoon, Tony Tubbs, no one wants to see that fight again. No one really wants you, man. Who wants to watch that rematch? You know, like, I'm not going to say the first fight was bad. It actually wasn't terrible considering, but like, it wasn't a rematch anyone was clamoring for. Absolutely not. But they were still going to pick it up because it was a part of that tournament that Don was promoting, where he was making all the money on it and everyone was making nothing. And the only person that he wanted to put his claws in at that point was Mike Tyson, and he couldn't do it during the tournament. Even though there's that famous photo of him holding Mike up, you know, cradling him after Mike knocked out Trevor Berbick. Yeah, you know, Don wasn't able to get his claws into Mike until after Jimmy Jacobs passed away. What was that, around 87, 88 or whatever it was?
Yeah.
So, you know, it was until then Don had all his middle and heavyweights around that he was just kind of, you know, playing chess with. But it's sad, man, because Witherspoon had so much potential. And you really watch it too, bro, after we're like in the early 90s, in the mid 90s, when he had that slight resurgence where, you know, he gets back on HBO and he like absolutely just throttled Al Cole for a comprehensive decision. And then he knocks the hell out of Jorge Luis Gonzalez. And then he has his fight with Ray Mercer afterwards, which could have gone either way. And it's like, you see that and you're just kind of like, you know, man, because of all that BS he went with King, all those years wasted from like, because that fight with Bone Crusher happened at 86? So 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, like a good 7 years. Like he was still fighting, don't get me wrong. He still had a few fights here and there or whatever, but like he was basically blackballed out of, you know, the upper echelon of the division, echelon, whatever. So yeah, it's just sad, man. Witherspoon's a tragic case out of that group.
Yeah, dude. It's unfortunate because, and he also did the same shit that Ray Mercer did in the early 2000s, where he had a handful of fights and was trying to come back and, like, you know, get a title shot and just, you know, Ray Mercer got a lot farther than he did. He actually got pretty close with the Klitschko shot at Vladimir Klitschko. But, you know, obviously, man, that was kind of sad because there were actually moments in that fight where Mercer was out jabbing Klitschko.
Yes, I mean, he marked up Klitschko's eye, man.
Yeah.
But then I remember when he got dropped, and he got dropped hard on his face, and I never seen Mercer get dropped before.
He caught him with that hook off the jab, dude. I remember it. Like he just there's the jab hook that like he just didn't even see. And I remember it was like his legs were just not there. Like he went to take a step, and he's like, "Woo, woo."
And he just went on his face, right?
Yeah, it was, dude. That was I don't know why I remember that so well, but I do.
It was a
That shit,
dramatic
I haven't
knockdown,
seen that in
man.
a
I mean, it
while.
was like a hard knockdown, and then he got up, and I remember this too because at the end of the round, I think he went woo or something like that.
Yeah, like he was, dude, because you not that many people hurt Ray Mercer. You know,
Well,
like
that was
you
the
was.
first time, man. I mean, most guys like not. It's rare for a chin to really go like that. You know what
I
I
think
mean?
Holyfield knocked him down too.
He did, but
Yeah,
it
yeah,
wasn't like that hard. Like he
yeah,
wouldn't just
yeah. No,
jump
not
out.
like that. Like it was like
Yeah.
accumulation kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that shit was. Yeah, dude. That was I damn. I'm probably about to go find out those. Fuck, I haven't seen in a long time.
Well, I
But
mean, especially considering the punches that Witherspoon landed on Mercer. There's like the the guy on YouTube, Jeff Jackson, who makes highlight videos. He made a highlight video of that one. And if you watch one of those rounds, you hear Larry Merchant like he just saw a hurricane come because you just hear you see Witherspoon with an overhand right that visibly rocks Mercer. Like he almost knocks him across the ring. Boom! And you see Mercer and you hear Merchant. Wow!
yeah, I do miss Larry. There were times when I'm watching old broadcasts and I'm just like, holy shit, nobody caught him saying that, or like, damn, nobody was just like, shut the fuck up, bro. Like, because there are times, but there are also times when I'm just like, damn, they need a Larry to just like say some shit when some shit needs to be said on a broadcast. And there are times when there's some fucking great broadcasts with the merch, bro.
I always loved that he added his scorecard, even though no one really ever asked for it.
Yeah,
At the
yeah.
end,
Yeah, and he'd always do it to like almost like undermine fucking Harold too.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Jim, and he'd be like, I have it, the total opposite. You're like, damn,
I have it so and so and so. Yeah. And not only that, if you had Gil Clancy on there too, he had his own scorecard, and then you had three different people giving their own shit at the same time. It's like, bro, this is what you hired Harold for. Just leave it to him.
Yeah, Clancy was definitely a last worder for sure.
Yeah.
Unified Rules Association of Boxing Commissions. Jim.
I watched Foreman more the other day, and like Lampley is like all in the moment. He goes, it happened, like whatever, and then you all of a sudden you hear Gil Clancy, can't believe it, I can't believe it. This is a guy who I thought was a clubber, was a da-da-da, and then right after, like, Larry, Jim would say something else. He was like, the right hand that eviscerated Michael Moore. He's like, it sure did. Sure fooled me.
Jim Lampley, like, whatever. I don't have anything specifically against him, but that fool was always looking for like the perfect call. He's always looking for some fucking college word to throw in there. Serendipitous something. Say, it's like, fuck, man. Come on, just call that shit. You don't need to fucking whip out the Oxford Dictionary, baby.
But it happened. It's one of the most iconic calls in history. Still.
Yeah, shit was great. But we're gonna get out of here pretty soon here, but I actually did think real quick of one that was actually semi-recent. The Pacquiao one's not that long ago, but this is a little bit more recent and is a big reason why we're having one of the kind of current, stars or whatever. I mean,
I know
it's kind of left, out in the ether there for now, whether or not he's an actual star. I think it's for the moment more hype than anything, but he's got an opportunity, and that's Jaime Munguia. Okay. He's the guy who came up in 2018. He replaced, I think it was Liam Smith against Saddam Ali. And I think that Saddam Ali, and especially in retrospect, against Liam Smith probably would have been a much more competitive fight. They just didn't realize that I guess they were dealing with a dude in Munguia who was like cutting 50 pounds overnight, apparently.
Huge.
Yeah.
And what makes it even more interesting is that Munguia was rejected as an opponent for Triple G because they thought he was just a kid who would get annihilated.
Yeah, and I mean, in retrospect, that shit could have been at least interesting, but
would have been a lot better than who would they settle on? Vanas? I think it was.
My God, dude. And there were people defending that. There were people just like, no. I'm like, no. Don't do that. But no, yeah, the Jaime Munguia, Saddam Ali already kind of as a farewell opponent for Miguel Cotto. That's another thing. Don't do, fighters. Don't have a farewell fight, dude. If it's going to be your last fight, don't say shit and then just say shit afterward. Okay. Because then you're doomed.
I worked that fight. Yeah.
Man, Miguel Cotto, after a storied career, of course, his last fight, his farewell fight or whatever, and then chooses an opponent who's like just style wise not the greatest style for him, like somebody who's not going to cooperate, somebody who has a lot of amateur experience, somebody who knows how to box and knows how
was very motivated that night too.
Yeah, and motivated. Yeah, dude, like you bring somebody in for their, come on, giving him a reason to kick your ass. Yeah. And Miguel Cotto was just at the end of his career, couldn't do a damn thing with him. So I mean, Saddam Ali, who is not a star overnight, because it's kind of like, I think a lot of people recognize that he defeated an older Miguel Cotto or whatever, but nonetheless, he'd obviously kind of shot to the forefront overnight or whatever.
I was going to bring up one more then, because I thought you were actually going in this direction. And that is one of the current, depending on who you look at it, maybe the best pound for pound fighter on the planet today, Terence Crawford. Because wasn't he a replacement for to fight Brady Prescott?
I think so. I'm not positive, but I think so. But I couldn't tell you who Prescott was supposed to fight before that. Who?
I'm almost positive it wasn't supposed to be Crawford though.
Now I'm about to look, because I mean, I've said it before on other shows. I just don't remember. I don't specifically remember this, whether or not he was a replacement, but I was at this fight and I remember saying, somewhat recently as a late replacement, little, but has at least replacement. Yeah, I guess he was. I guess you're right. But, I wasn't like an automatic, immediate Bud Crawford fan right at that moment. But I obviously did.
Nah. But that was an impressive fight. It took me a while to get in there because, he he whooped Prescott that night. But I remember the reason why I remember he was the last minute, because they were mentioning during the fight that Cameron Duncan, who was Crawford's manager, wasn't like keen on actually matching him. He brought it up to him, but I don't think he really wanted him to take it because he was kind of like worried. And Crawford was just like, nah, this is like a big opportunity. I have no, I'll take it in a second, please.
Yeah, I'm looking to see who he was replacing. Well, I don't immediately see it. For some reason, it's not popping up. But in any case, it doesn't really matter. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me also that somebody wouldn't want him as a replacement too, because again, we're talking about a guy who Terence Crawford had a shitload of amateur experience, was a really, like, I don't want to say a hot prospect, but was a known prospect at the time. And so, I mean, like, I don't know, Brady's Prescott always running hot and cold. Like, you never knew which Brady's Prescott was going to show up, dude. Like, that's why it was a shock that he took out Amir Khan. However, again, like I always say, you always beware of those South American punchers, dude. If a South American has a lofty record and you've never seen him fight before, do not bring him in. Don't bring him in against your prospect, dude. Trust me.
Now we've seen it too many times, man.
Way too many times.
Epi Mendoza, when he came over and knocked the hell out of Michael Olajude's brother. I think
Marcos Maidana Ortiz.
Yeah, Victor Ortiz.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't, I don't think that was a replacement, but still, it was like, nobody knew Maidana and shit.
Well, I mean, you just bring him in as just like an opponent that no one's ever heard of, and have a crazy record with a bunch of knockouts. Even if they're not their most skilled type of guy, they probably can punch like a fucking mule.
Yeah, dude, I'm telling you, it's asking for it, because, and this is, I'm sorry to just like start quoting myself here, but this is another shit that I say, dude, is that even when fighters, if you've never seen them before and a guy has a record of like 30-0 with 28 knockouts, right? Your first instinct, especially if they've never fought someone you've never seen them fight or whatever, and they're from some locale that's not known as a boxing place, your first instinct is to dismiss them and say they've knocked out a bunch of bums. So what? But again, what I've said before and will continue to say is knocking out a bunch of bums is still difficult. even if you've only, even if you've knocked out 28 of 30 bums, that's still knocking out a lot of fucking bums. And that guy probably still has some punching power.
Yep.
So I'm just saying. But yeah, that's, another instance of that happening. But circling back to this, the Saddam Ali and Munguia, again, it kind of remains to be seen. I think that Munguia is so raw and has had so much issue with his style and trying to figure out what his style is, and et cetera, that like we don't even really know what to make of him yet, to be honest. But still,
I mean, I'm excited to see his potential. He had that big fight. Oh, you talking about Munguia? He had that big fight on recent fight with Gabe Rosado, and I think he's improving under Morales. I mean, Morales seems to be a pretty good trainer with him and is gelling well with him.
I agree. Yeah.
I don't think his power is all that concussive, but he's still a bruising guy. He's still big. He's still young. He's still developing, and I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah, I think that moving up in weight a little bit, his power is obviously not as big because he's just not that much bigger than an opponent or whatever, but still he's developed enough that it's still interesting. He's not somebody that I'm ready to dismiss or anything like that.
No, for sure, man. I'm pretty excited for his future, and I want to see him I'd love to see him against like a Castano or one of the Charlos or wherever. Like, I just want to see him in big fights, man. He makes for good fights. I'd still love to see him against Triple G eventually. I'd love to see him against Murata. That would be a hell of a fight because Murata's the type of guy that's not going to run away from anybody. There's lots of big fights from out there. So,
yeah, for sure. Yeah, it sounds like that Murata fight's probably going to happen at some point. I don't know if they've rescheduled it. I saw some people talking about it earlier today.
But, the Triple G Murata fight?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's what's going to happen is that if Triple G wins his fight and if Canelo beats Bivol, then they're going to have their third fight, which I'm like, meh, but I'm sure
I'll say this much. I would say that if both of those fights in the meanwhile, like if Golovkin defeats Murata and it's a good win, and Canelo defeats Dimitri Bivol and it's a good win, I would feel a lot more enthusiastic about that third fight if that happened.
For sure.
Because a lot of, for me, was why I'm kind of just like, about a third Golovkin fight. And I know we're not talking about last minute replacements now, but fuck it, whatever. For me, a lot of the issue with a third Golovkin fight is that we don't know like what he has left. We don't know what he looks like. We don't know what the last few years have done to him because he's largely been chasing the Canelo fight. He's been chasing a Canelo fight for going on 10 years now, dude. So like he's gotten 2 out of it. That's great. He might get a third, but he's spent so much time chasing those fights that we don't know how much he's diminished. So if he's able to show in the meanwhile against Murata, like he blasts Murata out, I'd be like, fuck yeah, let's get that third fight on then, especially if Canelo beats Bivol. Like if he blasts Bivol out, I'd be like, fuck yeah, let's do this. But those are 2 fairly big ifs. That's the problem.
Yeah, man. Bivol is going to be a very, very tough fight for Canelo. I mean, I've said that. We've said that for many other guys, but I think
I know. Yeah, I know. We keep thinking everybody's going to be a tough fight, but that Mexican beef, bro.
Yeah, I know, man. I have no idea, bro. He just. It's tough to say, man. It's like Bivol has that really, he's a very, very good stylist. He can move. He does have pop. He's very, well-rounded fighter and all that. And he seems like he'd have the type of style because of his height and his length and everything else that he should give Canelo trouble. But
he's had a couple of kind of wonky performances himself, so it's like,
yeah, absolutely,
there's room there.
And I'm sure if they're looking at that fight, they probably do see things in his game that they could probably take advantage of too. So it's just kind of like
Yeah, I don't know, man. But like I said, if those 2 things happen, if they both win their fights in the meanwhile, and I will have to, and I do give them credit too, because they're both taking meaningful fights in the meanwhile, like not bullshit, like fights just to get through, whatever. But those are meaningful fights. So I got to give them credit if that does wind up happening. That's cool stuff. But
hey, man, I'm all for it.
Yeah, hopefully no last minute replacements for those motherfuckers for sure. Hey, dude, I appreciate you going over the last minute replacements with me, man. It's always a good
This was a
time when
lot
we
of
do the
fun.
history
This was an
shows.
absolute blast today, man. As always.
Yeah, dude, we went from 1914 all the way up to 2018. So we covered a century. We're all right. I think we did okay.
That's what we call boxing history, bro.
That's right, dude. I think we did all right. Hey, well, everybody who listened in, we appreciate you. If you listen on any of the podcast apps, please hit subscribe on those. Leave us a rating. That's appreciated. If you watched on YouTube, do please subscribe on YouTube. Leave a comment. That's also appreciated. And if you're on social media, for instance, if you're on Twitter, go ahead and follow my dude follow my guy Aris at Punch Zone Aris on Twitter. Follow me, Patrick Connor, at Patrick M. Connor. Go ahead and find Knuckles and Gloves Boxing Radio on Facebook and Instagram. And that's about it, man. Aris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Sounds good, man. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Take it easy, everybody.